The dense forest stretched out beyond the reach of any modern civilization, its trees ancient and towering, coated in a blanket of thick snow. Winter had gripped the wilderness with a chilling embrace, and only the hardiest of creatures could endure its relentless grasp. Here, in this forgotten place, the animals roamed freely, unburdened by human influence. There were no roads, no paths, no trails leading through the frozen wilderness, just the deep, untouched snow and the sounds of nature, the crunch of hooves, the flutter of wings, and the soft rustle of wind through branches heavy with ice. At the heart of this untamed landscape, a lone reindeer stood. His coat was dark against the snow, his breath clouding in the frosty air as he surveyed the forest. His name was Mikkel, and he had been raised in this wild sanctuary, born in the heart of the coldest winters and hardened by the trials of the land. For his kind, survival meant instinct, patience, and a quiet understanding of the land around them. But today, something was wrong. Mikkel stood still, his ears pricked listening to the soft murmurs of the forest. The wind howled as it passed between the trees, but there was something else. Something that tugged at the back of his mind. He could feel it in the way the air tasted, the way the ground shifted beneath his hooves. The forest was not at peace. It felt unsettled. With a slow, deliberate movement, Mikkel turned and began walking. His hoofs sank deep into the fresh snow with each step, leaving a trail behind him that would be visible for days. His breath came in steady puffs, his body moving with the surety of one who had navigated these woods for many winters. The snow crunched beneath him, the only sound in the stillness of the wilderness. He moved with purpose, ears flicking at the slightest sound, a snap of a branch here, a distant rustle there. It was as if he was being watched, though by whom or what, he could not tell. A few paces ahead, a shadow moved in the distance. Just beyond the trees, where the forest thickened and the light from the gray sky barely reached the ground. Mikkel paused, his muscles tensing, his breath momentarily halting. His keen eyes narrowed, trying to make sense of the movement. A deer? A wolf? He took another step, and then another. The movement stopped, as though the forest itself had held its breath. The shadow was gone, swallowed by the dense trees and swirling snow. But something had changed. Mikkel turned again, following the faint path of disturbed snow. Something was moving in the forest. Something that was no longer just a distant presence. There was no sign of danger yet, no scent of predators. Still, his instincts were alive, alert to the unfamiliar. It wasn't just the forest that was unsettled, it was him. As the minutes passed, the tension in the air grew thicker. The snow, once soft and welcoming beneath his hooves, now seemed to grow more treacherous, each step heavier than the last. Mikkel felt the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. His every movement watched, anticipated. Then the wind shifted. Mikkel froze. The wind carried a new scent, one that made his heart beat faster. It was the scent of something large, something unfamiliar. His muscles coiled, ready to flee if needed. But the snow was deep and the cold was biting. There was no safe place to run, no escape from the heavy weight of the atmosphere pressing in on him. He moved again, slower now, quieter. Every step was calculated, deliberate. His senses were on high alert. Each sound, each movement magnified in his mind. The wind, the shifting snow, the whisper of branches against the sky. He was no longer walking alone in the forest. He was being followed. His hooves crunched louder as he quickened his pace, and for a moment the silence was broken, only to be swallowed again by the oppressive stillness. He looked over his shoulder, his breath short and sharp, his body tense with the urge to flee. There, just beyond the trees, something moved again. A figure, no, Two figures emerged from the shadows, half hidden by the snowstorm. Mikhail's heart thudded in his chest. They were unlike any creatures he had encountered before. Tall, slender, with dark, patchy coats blending into the forest around them. They were not predators, no, they were something else. Something ancient. The figures paused, their heads cocked as if they were listening for something. Then they began to move forward, gliding effortlessly through the snow, their eyes locked on Mikhail. He could feel the weight of their gaze, even from this distance. The air seemed to thrum with their presence, as though the very earth beneath him was vibrating with a forgotten rhythm. Mikkel's hoofs slid on the ice as he tried to retreat, his muscles protesting against the strain. He turned again, his ears flicking nervously as the shadows approached. But then, as quickly as they had appeared, the figures vanished back into the snowstorm, leaving Mikhail standing alone again, his breath sharp in the cold air. For a moment, he stood frozen, staring into the whiteness, unsure of what had just happened. Had he imagined it? The wind howled louder now, as though mocking his uncertainty. His heart pounded in his chest as he slowly began to walk again, the path ahead now seeming infinitely longer, more treacherous. With each step, his sense of dread deepened. And then there was the sound. A low guttural growl broke the silence, sending a wave of terror through Mikhail's body. He spun around, eyes wide, as a massive shadow loomed in the snowstorm, emerging from the swirling chaos of white. A wolf. No, not just one wolf, but a pack. They were closing in, their eyes gleaming with hunger, their movements swift and silent in the storm. Mikhail's instincts screamed for him to run, but the pack was too close now. He could feel the ground beneath him trembling with their approach. The air itself seemed to crackle with tension, as if the forest itself had become a battleground. In the distance, something else moved. A flicker of dark shapes against the snow, a herd of reindeer, their hooves cutting through the ice with urgent precision. They had come for him. Mikhail ran. The snowstorm tore at his face as he sprinted through the forest, his hooves slipping on the slick ice. The wolves were close behind now, their growls echoing through the trees, but the herd was there, just ahead, waiting for him. The sound of their hooves pounding the earth filled the air, a symphony of urgency. Mikkel's breath came in sharp bursts, his heart pounding with the frantic rhythm of escape. He could feel the wolves gaining on him, the cold air burning in his lungs, but the herd was close now, and with a final burst of energy, Mikkel leapt forward, diving into the safety of their midst. The wolves stopped at the edge of the clearing, their eyes narrowing, hesitant. They could not cross the line that the herd formed. The reindeer stood together, their bodies braced against the snow, their antlers raised in defense. The wolves, despite their hunger, knew better than to challenge the strength of a unified herd. And so, as the snowstorm raged around them, the pack of wolves faded into the shadows of the forest. The tension in the air finally dissipated, leaving behind a heavy silence. Mikhail stood among the reindeer, his body trembling, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The forest was still again, but as the herd turned and began to move onward, a sense of unease lingered in Mikhail's chest. The storm had not passed. The danger had not truly ended. There was something else in the forest, something older, something he would have to face again. For now, though, he walked. The snow crunched beneath his hooves, the world as silent as it had ever been. But in his heart, the forest whispered of the dangers yet to come. The herd moved slowly, their hooves making soft imprints in the thick snow as they pressed forward, their movements synchronized in quiet harmony. Mikkel stayed at the edge, his mind still reeling from the sudden appearance of the wolves and the strange figures that had lingered in the storm. He was not fully present in the moment, his thoughts clouded by the mystery of what had just happened and what might be still to come. The wind howled again, a long, mournful sound that seemed to reverberate through the trees. The air felt heavier now, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Mikhail's ears flicked nervously. He had learned to trust his instincts, and right now, his instincts were screaming at him to move faster, to get away from this place, from the shadows that still clung to the corners of his mind. But the herd moved with purpose, steady and sure. Their silent communication was all Mikhail needed to stay with them for now. They were a group, a family in the cold. And while the dangers of the forest had proven themselves, there was strength in numbers. For the moment, he was safe. The snow was falling more heavily now, thick, swirling flakes that seemed to blot out the world beyond the immediate circle of trees. The horizon was a hazy blur, as if the storm itself was erasing the lines between the present and the past. But it wasn't the storm that unsettled Mikhail. It was the feeling that something was watching them, lingering just out of sight. He glanced over his shoulder once more, scanning the trees, but saw nothing, only the swirling, endless snow. Suddenly, one of the younger reindeer near the front of the herd froze, its head raised high as if it had heard something far off. The others followed, different. The usual quiet hum of the forest was absent. The wind still howled, but now it felt unnatural, as though it was carrying something more than just the chill of winter. It was as if the forest had stilled, waiting for a sound that never came. The young reindeer, still motionless, was staring into the dense woods to their left, its dark eyes wide, its nostrils flaring in sudden anxiety. Mikhail held his breath. The rest of the herd seemed to understand instinctively. Their bodies were taut, their eyes darting, but they remained silent, waiting, like the forest itself had gone into hiding. Then, from deep within the woods, came the sound of a footstep, slow, deliberate, but unmistakable. It was a crunch in the snow, a sound that was different from the usual crackling of branches or the settling of snow on the ground. This was a heavy step, one that carried a weight and intention that Mikhail could feel in his bones. The hairs on his neck stood on end. His pulse quickened as he tried to determine the direction of the noise. It was impossible to tell. The thick blanket of snow had muffled everything, and now there was only the soft, distant sound of the wind stirring the branches above. But there it was again, a slow, rhythmic crunch, coming closer. The reindeer were restless now, their unease palpable. They began to shift, their hooves scraping lightly against the snow, as if preparing to flee. Mikhail motioned for calm, his voice barely a whisper as he tried to settle them. But deep down, he knew there was nothing he could say to comfort them. Whatever was out there, the herd could feel it too. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the sound stopped. For a long moment, Mikhail stood in the eerie silence, listening. Nothing moved. The storm had begun to intensify, and the snow was falling so thickly now that the world beyond the trees had become a gray blur. The only shapes were the dark outlines of the reindeer, their eyes reflecting the dull light of the overcast sky. Suddenly, a piercing shriek split the air, a sound so unnatural, so wild, that it made Mikhail's blood run cold. It wasn't an animal's cry. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. Something that shouldn't exist in the world of the living. The herd panicked. In an instant, the reindeer scattered in all directions, their hooves pounding the snow as they bolted through the trees. Mikhail's heart raced and he cursed under his breath, grabbing for his whistle to call them back. But the sound of the shriek had unsettled him beyond reason, and the herd was in full flight now, driven by pure, unadulterated fear. Then, a shadow moved in the trees, too large, too fast to be anything natural. It was a blur, a streak of black and white against the white backdrop. Michael could barely track its movement before it vanished again, swallowed by the falling snow, and still that same eerie silence settled over everything. Michael sprinted after the herd, the sound of his breath harsh in his ears, but the panic had spread. His legs burned as he pushed forward, slipping and sliding in the snow. The storm had turned the ground into a maze, and he had lost sight of the reindeer. He had to find them. Then, in the distance, he saw a flash, a dark shape in the woods moving quickly. His heart skipped a beat. The reindeer, he was close. He stumbled toward the shape, his eyes wide, the snow clinging to his skin as he pushed through the underbrush. His thoughts were a blur, frantic, but everything slowed when he saw them. His breath caught in his throat as he skidded to a halt. The herd had gathered, all huddled together in a tight formation. Their heads were lowered, their bodies trembling as if caught in some collective moment of intense dread. And standing in the center, in a perfect circle around them, was an unnatural figure. A human-like shape, but too tall, too slender. Its eyes glinted in the darkness, a faint shimmer like the reflection of moonlight off ice. And Mikhail's heart raced, and his breath became shallow. His mind was overwhelmed by the presence of the thing before him. It had no distinct features, just a silhouette that seemed to bend the very light around it. It was watching him, watching the herd, with an intensity that froze him in place. For a moment, nothing happened. The world felt suspended in time. The wind picked up again, swirling around them in a vortex of snowflakes. The shadow did not move, did not advance or retreat. It simply stood there, as if it were waiting. And then, with a sudden shift, the figure moved, its long, skeletal limbs taking deliberate steps toward the herd. The reindeer, frozen in place, did not run. They stood motionless, their eyes wide with terror. Their bodies were shaking uncontrollably. Mikhail's mind snapped into focus. He had to act. He couldn't let this thing claim the herd, couldn't let it. And then the world shifted once more. The ground beneath them trembled. The snow shifted, revealing something hidden beneath. A massive, gnarled root system, twisting and moving with a strange, unnatural energy. The thing was not merely walking in the woods. It was drawing from the earth itself. Mikkel took a step back. It was a trap. The storm, the eerie figure, it had all been orchestrated, pulling them in. A trap set by something ancient, something that had been watching them all along. The moment the realization hit him, the world exploded in motion. The figure surged forward, its limbs unnaturally long, its presence more terrifying than Mikkel had ever imagined. The herd scattered once more, but this time there was no chance of regaining control. The woods had become a maze, the storm a barrier. The mysterious figure continued its pursuit, as if the very trees themselves were aiding it, shaping the landscape to its will. And in the distance, Mikkel could hear the final echo of the shriek that had started it all, ringing out over the snowy hills, carrying with it the promise of something much darker than he could have ever imagined. Mikkel's heart hammered in his chest, the beat loud in his ears as he sprinted through the snow-choked forest. The figure, a grotesque silhouette, loomed in the distance, weaving through the trees with a speed that was both unnatural and terrifying. The storm had intensified, snowflakes now thick enough to stifle all light, turning the world into a blurred white nightmare. But through the veil of snow, he could still hear the eerie scraping of limbs, the crunch of its movements drawing closer. Panic was beginning to settle over him like a suffocating blanket. The herd was scattered now, each reindeer lost to the chaos, their panic making them unpredictable, their hooves leaving behind a web of frantic tracks in the snow. He had lost all sense of direction in the disorienting storm, but the presence of the creature was clear, as if it could see into his very soul. Every instinct in his body screamed to run, but he couldn't leave them behind. His legs burned from the cold and the effort, but he pushed forward, driven by desperation. The shadows in the trees seemed to pulse with an eerie rhythm, the branches creaking ominously as though something in the woods was watching. Then, the shriek came again. It was more deafening this time, a high-pitched wail that seemed to tear through the very fabric of the storm. It echoed, wrapping itself around Mikhail's mind, turning his thoughts into nothing but a blur of fear and instinct. The cry sent a chill through his bones, but it also fueled his resolve. The reindeer were still out there. He had to find them. He pushed on, heart racing, until the snow suddenly cleared in a burst. He stumbled into a small clearing, barely a patch of flat ground amid the wild chaos of trees and snow, and saw the herd, standing in a tight circle, their heads low, their eyes wide and filled with dread. But something was different now. The figure, the creature, was standing in the middle of them. Mikhail froze. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. It was as if time had stopped, leaving only the whisper of the wind in the trees. The creature was tall, impossibly tall. Its limbs were unnaturally long, and its skin glinted a pale, ghostly white, the color of frost. Its face, if you could call it a face, was hollow, with black, empty eyes that seemed to draw in the surrounding light, leaving only the reflection of the storm in their depths. A mouth, thin and twisted, stretched from ear to ear, but it did not move. It just stood there, towering over the reindeer, waiting. Mikhail's pulse thundered in his chest. Every part of him screamed to run, to retreat and never look back. But his body refused to obey. It was as if the very air around him had become thick with the creature's presence, freezing his movements, freezing his thoughts. The reindeer stood, motionless, their eyes fixed on the creature. Their fear was palpable, but none of them dared to move. Then a sudden shift. The creature stepped forward. The snow beneath its feet cracked like ice breaking. The reindeer flinched, their hooves scraping against the snow, but still they did not flee. The forest had become a trap, a place where escape was impossible.